start the chat, let me spend a second just like welcoming everybody, and then I'll kick it over to you for just a little intro. But just for some quick grounding, everybody, welcome this morning, this evening, wherever you are. This is our Twitter Spaces series. We call it Creative Decentralization. The idea is pretty simple. Tableland is a pretty new, fresh project. We're trying to create a decentralized protocol for storing and using mutable, structured relational data in Web3. We're very excited about it, but there's so many things we need to learn along the way. And we've always been so inspired and fortunate to have projects that come before us that sort of pave the way on the right way to do these things. And so as we're kind of unpacking our own challenges, we thought it would be really fun to bring those inspiring projects in and talk with them in a very public way to learn from them and learn together. And I'll figure out how to do these things so that, you know, as you go build your own Tablelands, you go build your own protocols, your own communities, you can do these same things, and you have sort of the breadcrumbs along the way. I like to think about it. And so if you missed it, we've had a couple of these conversations, one with Juan Benet from Protocol Labs, builders of IPFS and Filecoin, and the second from Jiho, one of the co-founders at Axie Infinity. These are both recorded here in Spaces. They're also up on our YouTube channel. You can find those. But for today's session, if you missed kind of the early chat there, I'm very excited to be joined by Raphaël Haupt, the founder of Toucan Protocol. And Toucan is working to bring carbon markets to public blockchains, more or less. And that's a really simple way of explaining something that is pretty complicated under the hood, but also has really big implications if we do it right, and we can really see it all the way through, I guess is the way to say it. If you aren't familiar with Toucan, there's just a couple data points I'll share with you. They launched their first, what they call their carbon reference token, and we'll get into that a bit later, back in October. And in the first 2 months of launching, they tokenized 150,000 carbon credits. To date, I think their website reports 21 million tons of carbon credits have been transferred over the Toucan bridge. So that's 21 million carbon credits that are now swappable, tradable, buildable as these building blocks in Web3. And they're being used in a few different projects, and just kind of opening up a new possibility of ways to build with carbon credits. And a number that I thought was quite interesting is, so we'll probably have to define this a bit later, but the voluntary carbon market, the number I saw was that Toucan is accounting for something like 5% of carbon credits in that market right now. So it's a pretty, it's making an impact already outside of Web3 in the markets that already existed. So, and I think that very much will speak to Toucan's mission and why they're doing this, and why that number is important, and what it's doing out there in the real world. So today I want to learn more about this. I want to learn what the vision is. I want to learn why this is important. And of course, I want to figure out how it sort of clicks into the rest of Web3 projects, and how we can all make use of it and think about it in making our own projects sustainable and kind of pushing all of Web3 forward. So with that, welcome, Rafa.
Thanks. That was a really good intro.
Cool. I mean, how's it going? How's your morning?
My morning is already an evening. I'm based in Berlin. It was a crazy week. April was a crazy month. We've been like all over the place. We've been in Barcelona, Lisbon, Paris, and Amsterdam, like ETH Amsterdam for Dev Connect, which was so much fun. Actually, quick anecdote, because Toucan actually started as a hackathon project at ETH London. So that was in February 2020. And this year, ETH Amsterdam was the first in-person hackathon since ETH London. So because of COVID, all hackathons have been virtual till Amsterdam. And it was, we were sponsors of the event. I was a judge, and it was just such an incredible deja vu, or I remember so clearly sitting on the other side of this table and like pitching to these judges and being like super nervous and
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I remember actually I shared something about Toucan with a friend that like that's kind of works in this in outside of Web3 and this stuff. Well, I shared actually when you first had you had a Gitcoin grant, I think was back one of the first times I noticed you. And yeah, and I just was like, I was like, wow, this seems really promising. Some of these projects seem really promising, but what I really love is now seeing kind of the real momentum of Toucan and how it really demonstrates the way that the speed at which Web3 can allocate resources towards interesting solutions. And it's something that I think is hard outside of it's harder. There's a lot more friction outside of Web3. And it's one of the reasons I get so excited about trying to tackle real important problems like this using the foundation of Web3. And so we'll definitely come back to that. But I think maybe just so I don't think everybody that is going to be joining is going to know what Toucan is. Could you spend a minute and just tell us what Toucan is?
Sure. Well, so essentially Toucan exists to scale climate finance. And it's very simple. Climate change is a coordination failure. And Web3 is, gives us a lot of coordination tools, right? So Toucan started out of a premise that we can actually use like these tools in Web3 to address the climate crisis. And there's like multiple angles of this, right? So, and I liked your framing in the beginning where you said, right, like there's both exciting things that happen that you can do once you have programmable carbon on chain, but it also, like at the same time, a lot of stuff happens in the off-chain world, right? And ultimately, this is the world that we want to influence, right? So in a way, why do I care about like having carbon credits on chain? It's because the current carbon market essentially is quite opaque. It's mostly over the counter. Projects struggle to get financed because there's not a clear price signal, right? Because there's not a functioning spot market. And so essentially, when I first looked at this, I was like, well, at the end of the day, like we have all these tools, as you said, like the things that have already been built before us, like Uniswap, and like we could use these building blocks that already exist in Web3 to basically bring the carbon market on chain quite easily, and just make use of the composability in Web3 and just build it better on market, right? So, and what really changed in the last 2 years is that my personal belief changed from Web3 is a market for carbon credits to sell into, to basically there's a real opportunity to bring the whole carbon market on chain, really. And I think just leapfrogging from like Web1, because this is the state of the current carbon market, directly into Web3, right? So maybe because carbon markets are something that is probably not what everyone deals with if they come more from the Web3 side. So I'll try to give a quick intro to carbon markets. Essentially, the idea with carbon markets is let's put a price on carbon, right? So there's we operate in the voluntary carbon market. So what that means is essentially that it's a two-sided market. You have suppliers on the one hand, which are carbon projects that reduce emissions, projects that capture, sequester emissions from the atmosphere by planting trees, or so essentially projects that create positive externalities, right, in the form of carbon that is avoided or removed from the atmosphere. And for each ton of carbon, right, for each positive externality that they create like this, they get a carbon credit. So yeah, so basically for each positive externality, they get a carbon credit, which represents that. And then on the other side, you have polluters, you have companies essentially that are on the path to reducing their emissions, and they can buy these carbon credits and retire them, which is basically claiming the underlying positive externality for them to call themselves carbon neutral or something like that. So this is basically how the current carbon market works, right? And the biggest, I mean, so maybe just, so why is Web3 now important is because essentially carbon credits are these intangible assets, right? It's just a bunch of data they exist like in a old school database somewhere in these carbon standards, which are the one that issue these credits, right? And
actually, before you get there, maybe helpful to pause for a second. So carbon markets, couple questions about them. First, who's buying them? Is it only carbon creators, or like, because with carbon on chain, there seems to be, well, in your own mission, there's this idea of making carbon accessible to more capital. And so I'm curious, like, are institutional investors investing in carbon off chain? Is that market really a functional market off chain right now? And who's getting involved? Is it just carbon producers, or is it more?
Yeah, so this exactly kind of so right now the carbon market, mostly there's two buyers, right? Like there's the buyers who use carbon credits to retire them to make some environmental claim, and then there's speculators, right? There's resellers, brokers, funds. But it's it's not a very easy to access market. You need to have an account with these carbon standards, which is, I think there's roughly 3,000 accounts in total, because it's really hard to get one, etc. So it's quite a siloed market. It's not very structured. So so one of the ideas with Toucan is just making that market more accessible to everyone. Everyone can participate. Everyone can also bet on the rising carbon price, right? Because like if you look at carbon credits as a financial asset, they've been doing like extremely well over the past couple of years, right? So and it's just really hard for a end user to actually invest in carbon. But where I was going is like, I think there's much more interesting use cases for carbon credits than just using them to call yourself carbon neutral, right? Like this offsetting use case is essentially, if you think of it like as a society, as a global, as a civilization, the only good use case that we found for like positive externalities is to match them with negative externalities, to like call yourself neutral. And I think what Web3 offers us is to create novel incentives to produce positive externalities, right? That are not necessarily based on the amount of harm that you do yourself, and that you want to reduce, that you want to, And I think this is where, especially in the NFT space, but also like in the metaverse space, there's so many ways for people to create incentives to build with carbon, to retire carbon, and to essentially incentivize capital to flow to these projects which produce these positive externalities. And just to make a point, like one of the most phenomenal use cases, in my opinion, that we have in Web3 is simply by using carbon as a collateral asset to back currencies, right? We can essentially trigger a gold rush on carbon, right? So we saw this with Klimada, which was kind of the first experiment to try out a carbon-backed currency. And we are now also deploying the Toucan Protocol on Celo, because the Celo reserve has a mandate to allocate 40% of the reserve to natural capital currencies, of which carbon is the most prominent one, right? So this becomes really interesting. And we've seen the same thing with Maker, right? The clean money proposal of Maker, right? So this idea, if we back money with things that we actually care about and that are good for the planet, that heal the planet, as a user of a stable coin, for instance, you have a choice, right? You can hold your credits, or you can hold your stable coin in DAI, or like you can hold in USDC, right? And your choice would have a real impact on the planet. Totally.
I think you're getting at something that I felt before in my own career. I studied biology for my PhD, and I thought, I would go into academia and I would try to solve the world's problems there. And I felt this real frustration with the speed at which I think in my career, I've constantly sought out things that move faster, and so I moved out of academia and I moved into technology. And then when I was in technology, I moved to Web3, thinking, you see it and you're like, wow, things are moving so fast there. There's so few barriers. People are just experimenting as fast as they can. And yeah, and so I'm curious how your journey linked to Web3, because it's clear you had your head around sort of carbon and the environmental crisis and how these things came together. Was it just that? Was that the real first Web3 solve something here, or did you see another reason that this is where to solve it?
No, so I'm an engineer by training and like an energy engineer, and I got into Web3 in 2017, like so many, because my flatmate invested in Bitcoin and told me, wow, like you should check out Bitcoin, right? And I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like, what does it do? And then I wasn't so hyped about Bitcoin, but I was really hyped about Ethereum. And I was especially interested in the peer-to-peer energy trading use case that like everyone was doing back in 2017, 2018. The Brooklyn microgrid in New York is such an example where prosumers can trade electricity with each other. I mean, so that was kind of my first touch point with Web3. I was finishing school and I was looking for something to specialize in, and I was like, okay, energy and Web3, this is my niche. That's what I want to do. And then I got really interested in DAOs. That was in 2019, and I basically from there, like in Berlin with two friends, I helped like a dev shop to create a dev shop called Curve Labs, which essentially its purpose was to bring DAOs into the real world. And then that's when I fell down the carbon market rabbit hole, because I looked like, oh, okay, so so DAOs essentially are like a possibility to create a global governance layer. The problem with climate change is that we lack this global governance layer, and so I was just like curious, playing around, like how could we use DAOs to solve climate change. And that's when I went to ETH London. Yeah. And that's when I went to ETH London with that idea. And basically,
so that was 2019.
So that was like that was beginning of 2020.
Okay, so I have a kind of a question or an idea. I was trying to unwind, sustainability in Web3, the steps that got us where because my like kind of bullish stance on it right now, the like steps that got us to this environment. And coming into this call, and I was thinking back, and I suspect, there were a lot of projects like DAI you identified, and pretty much most hackathons I remember early on in my experience in this community had some track, maybe not sustainability, but always like a for good track, trying to fund and figure out how blockchain projects, smart contract projects could really fund and impact things that were good for the world. But sustainability and being carbon neutral or regenerative, I think the moment that it accelerated really so quickly was the moment that Tesla bought Bitcoin, because it basically was that moment that a spotlight was cast on it, and suddenly the whole world was talking about how bad blockchain was for the environment. And we saw all communities across blockchain suddenly light up and go, how do we fund it? How do we get smart people working on it? How do we get the right projects to surface? Does that history like land for you?
Yeah.
Do you think that's the moment?
No.
No. Okay.
I mean, yes and no, right? And maybe so for me, my personal experience was, so as I said, February 2020, nobody cared about this. I remember going to ECC. It was just before DeFi summer, right? Like carbon, climate, and crypto, like nobody cared. Then for me, it changed with like the NFT hype. And this is because like a completely new set of users came to Web3, and like artists and people who, cared about other things than just maybe making money and like and finance in general. So at least from my experience, that was the first time that this like the energy consumption of blockchains really became publicly discussed. However, I mean, I have to say, like for me, being like in energy and Web3 in 2010, like that was always the first, like whenever I said what I do, the first, people would always tell me, but isn't crypto bad for the environment? I was like, well, yes, but also maybe not, right? So, but definitely when Elon bought like Bitcoin, and then especially when they decided not to accept it any longer because of the environmental footprint, like that was, but I think it was a pretty like, it was a culmination of things. But I think really the NFT, the new set of users that came to Web3 because of the NFT bubble, or like hype, whatever you want to call it, created that attention, in my opinion.
Do you know the origin? And we haven't touched on it yet. But do you know when the term ReFi came out? Like, when did it pop up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I mean, without like, I mean, definitely the amount of attention, like still throughout last summer, like people started talking about like the environmental footprint, but not really about like the good, right? It was more focused on the bad, right? So I think it's really when we launched together with ClimateDAO in October that for the first time, a large amount of people realized, oh my God, like actually Web3 might be able to meaningfully impact the climate crisis. And it's funny. So if somebody here on Twitter is up for doing like a research on like #ReFi, I would love to. I don't know where it came from. I think it might be coming from, I think it comes either from Gregory Landra from Region, or from Sean Conway from IXO. Big shout out to those two people. They were for me like really important in my journey to Toucan. But I remember that when we tried to coin a term called DCLIFI, decentralized climate finance, which was like horrible. And when I first read ReFi, I was like, oh my God, like DCLIFI, really? I even bought the domain, like what? So, but we then like all kind of made an effort to meme this into existence, and it just became a thing, right? And then we had John Allison, who's also like in our team, who started ReFi DAO, and like John X, who's also in our team, like together they started the ReFi podcast. So we really tried to like create a momentum around this, and yeah, it's super exciting. ReFi DAO is now its own thing. It's
mean it into existence. That is the way, for sure. So okay, I mean, I think that's a great moment to like jump into Toucan, and let's talk the ton carbon token.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Vera. Let's talk about bridging. How would you unwrap how Toucan works? What are the main pieces people should understand?
Yeah. So really, they're really like two main pieces at this point, I would say. One being the carbon bridge that essentially connects the off-chain world with the on-chain world. So similar to how bridges work from like Ethereum to Polygon, right? And then the other one is the carbon pools, which allow carbon credits with similar attributes to be grouped together and to become liquid, essentially, right? So carbon credits currently live in the off-chain world. They live in a registry. We are connected to the biggest registry, which is the Vera registry, which holds approximately 75% of all credits in the world from the voluntary carbon market. And what we allow, we just infrastructure that allows owners of these off-chain credits to move them on chain and get a token that represents that, basically, right? And what's the true innovation with Toucan was that when we bring these carbon credits on chain, we keep all the metadata attached to the carbon credit. And this is because carbon credits are kind of semi-fungible assets. So it really matters where a project is located. It really matters which technology type it is, right? It's a difference if it's like a solar project, if it's a reforestation project, or if it's like a direct air capture project, right? And it's not just a difference because it's a different name, it's just a difference in price, mostly, and impact. So So essentially the output of the carbon bridge, the Toucan carbon bridge, is TCO2 credits. So TCO2s are these semi-fungible carbon credits. And then the carbon pools are essentially, I live in Berlin, so I always describe them as like, they're similar to like a club where you have a bouncer standing in front of the club, and the bouncer has an agenda, and it says, for instance, like we have a nature carbon pool, which only allows nature carbon credits to be deposited into that pool, right? And only nature carbon credits of a certain, that are 2012 or newer from their production. And so essentially you as a user have the opportunity, the possibility to deposit your TCO2s into that carbon pool to mint an NCT, a nature carbon ton, right? And so what does that do? It basically means that all carbon credits right now from different places that are all nature-based, they can suddenly go into this nature carbon pool and become fully fungible. And then there's like a sushi pool right now that, you know, allows people to basically trade that. And you can go back, right? So you can basically burn your NCT to redeem one of the underlying TCO2s back out of it, right? So you keep that, it's kind of like a coupon that lets you redeem one of the underlying carbon credits. So you can still pick, you know, which project you want to get out, if you want to offset for like a specific credit from a specific country because you care or whatever, then you still have that freedom.
I love the bouncer. I love the bouncer analogy. My head immediately went to experiences getting turned down from clubs. And so
I'm sorry.
There's something there. No, there's something there that's pretty nice because of the, like, you know, this is you have kind of the trendy pool, the exclusive pool, I guess is what I'm thinking, that is like, you know, carbon wants to be part of, because it's the more demanded, you know, pool, that it actually, there's a financial difference between 1 ton of carbon depending on, you know, its provenance. And
yeah, exactly.
And I think the pool is
that. Yeah. So we have 2 pools right now: the base carbon pool, which is supposed to be like the floor price of carbon, and the nature carbon pool, and they roughly trade like at a 2x difference from each other. And obviously there's more pools to come.
Wow, so 2x. That's amazing. Yeah. So yeah, really interesting, because I know it seems like, you know, Toucan is creating these technologies that address carbon markets, but that's obviously not the final thing, right? Like that's like a step along the way. And so, you know, back when I was doing my PhD, I remember discovering work on natural capital back then, and going, oh yeah, this stuff looks amazing. Like I was like at the end of my PhD, and I was like, should I just go back to the beginning and focus all my efforts on this? And I hadn't really thought about it too deeply since back then, but I was getting ready for this chat. I was just kind of looking at what was the significant progress in natural capital markets since then. And it seems like I was looking at some reports from 2020. They call it the Experimental Ecosystem Accounting Project, which is basically supposed to quantify ecosystems at a national level. So we even have a baseline to start measuring, you know, the pluses and minuses. And I was thinking to myself, that was like 1 or 2 decades of focused effort and a whole lot of input before that. And it's just not moving very fast. So how do you see Toucan accelerating, you know, with pools, maybe unlocking new markets, how does it branch out from there and just let us move faster?
Yeah. So if you said you found us on the first Gitcoin project, our name back then was still CO Toucan, right? So we had the CO2 in the name. And one of the reasons to go to just Toucan Protocol and remove the CO2 is because this problem is obviously bigger than just carbon, right? And why are we focused on carbon right now is because there's an existing market. It acts a bit as a proxy for other types of environmental or like ecosystem services, but it's not a really good proxy, right? So what we see right now is like there's other markets that are kind of slowly maturing. Like biodiversity credits are becoming a thing, water credits, et cetera. So in my vision, like all of these things should exist and should live on Toucan, because it just makes sense, right? To have like a central open platform where we just can keep track. We can keep track of these intangible assets, environmental assets. So, and this is also, I think, important to. So right now we're connected to Vera, but there's different registries, different standards out there, and most importantly, there's new ways of measuring and creating credits in the first place. Right? There's a lot of projects that are using satellite data or drones or other form of like basically they are much more data driven than the current way to verify carbon or other ecosystem services. And all these projects right now, they still need a place to issue the credit, right? And to make it tradable. And what Toucan essentially allows them is to do inventory management, or directly on Toucan, and be connected to a market, to a functioning market, to demand, but also to lending markets, to all kinds of all the craziness that comes with
in blockchain, my mind always goes to the paperclip problem, right? Which if we create all the incentives on chain, we make it all programmatic. Do we end up building the biggest paperclip factory that takes over the world, right? Like I don't know if I explained that very well, but I was thinking of that in the vein of Toucan, and I was thinking, okay, if I removed all my understanding of the world, and maybe this is actually a good strategy, and I was thinking, how would I lock up the most carbon, back to just the carbon pools for the world? Wouldn't the most direct strategy, or one of the most direct strategies, be that Toucan just buys oil reserves? Like, do you see like why not just increase the price of oil by allocating money to oil reserves and creating your own carbon offsets, in a sense? Like, do you see the protocol getting that intelligent, that strategic?
I don't think it would be Toucan, to be honest, right? So I think we are focused on building an infrastructure that empowers others and to build on top of us, right? I think what you're describing is an incentive machine, right? Mm-hmm. That we need to create. It's like, how do we, like, what incentives can we create on top of Toucan or other protocols that do that, right? That just buy up oil and I think this is like, you need to have some economic gains, some way for people to participate in this. So interestingly, with Toucan, we don't actually own carbon credits. Like, we own a couple, but really not many. And this was a conscious decision not to participate in the trading too much and move the price or whatever, right? So no, I don't think this would be Toucan buying up all the oil. However, I am intrigued by these kind of out there, what can we do to really, I'm not sure that buying up the oil, increasing the price, makes it more attractive again, right? So we probably would need to think quite deeply how the chain of reaction that this triggers, but
so kind of going a little less distant. I don't know if I read this on the Toucan site or a blog post, but sort of back to those two branches of innovation. We were talking about this in the banter that before the call, that if people missed it, but basically, if you look at where Toucan does sit, it seems to be unlocking two different directions of innovation. One is, now that the carbon is on chain, it can be this Lego, and like you're saying, other people can come along and build it into all different forms and layer on all different kinds of incentives and do all these experiments really quickly. And we can figure out what actually drives new demand for the market and new ways of making sort of carbon more expensive, essentially. And then, but then this is the other direction of innovation, which is like, now that we have this new source of demand, we have this new source of innovation, and like what you're getting at with grouping by metadata, there's this new source of demand for the quality, not only the quality of the carbon being recorded, but the quality of reporting, the quality of sort of auditing and making sure that this stuff's real, the quality of like you were talking about timestamps, the quality of a carbon record from 5 years ago versus one today, it might mean quite different things depending on where it came from. And so how is Toucan, I guess first, well, the question I want to ask is like how Toucan is thinking about moving or like using its success to move the needle off of blockchain as well, and like what your ideas are there. And then also, like you said, you don't actually own the carbon offsets. You don't, that's not your place. So where does Toucan even make money to then drive innovation off of blockchain? Can you explain that for folks a little bit?
Sure. So I'll start with your first question of how do we impact the Web2 world or Web1 world. For that, like, it's important to understand like how the current market works. Is like carbon credits are mostly bought or resold by intermediaries, right? So the brokers or retailers. Today, these retailers they have to buy up a certain amount of supply, like they make deals with projects directly or with other resellers, and then they have to hold that in inventory, and then they're trying to find buyers, and they're going to sell it at a pretty significant premium, because this like last step of like selling credits to an end customer is very time consuming, basically. So what we want to do is we want to allow these actors to tap into the supply that is on chain, because essentially Toucan right now is a huge warehouse of credits that are always available 24/7, programmable. You don't have to ask for permission. There's like it's such a paper intensive and long process to buy carbon credits today, because it's all over the counter. You do like purchase agreements. You have to get both legal teams involved, right? So if we remove all this friction, this just like for these traditional for the entities that currently hold these end customer relationships, this is just like it's a pretty amazing deal. For the projects themselves, which are the ones that we actually want to impact the most, for the projects themselves, right now, when they get their credits issued, what they do is normally they sell those to intermediaries, because they don't have contracts to the end buyer, and because they need the money to continue the next circles, the next iteration of their project, right? So they usually just sell most of their supply for like not much, or for whatever price that they can get in the market to continue. With Toucan, first of all, by just these carbon pools are just an always online demand source, right? So they could just tokenize and just sell directly into the pool, and if the price is like, and they make the margin basically. But if they're bullish on carbon as an asset, which most projects currently are, they could just get a loan, right? They could use those carbon credits as collateral, get a loan, use that money to develop the next batch of credits, et cetera, right? Pay back the loan with the credits, et cetera. So there's numerous ways where like this has real impact for the Web2 world, but there's still a lot of friction from moving on chain and off chain. And right now, our like product team and engineers are working really hard on like reducing the friction and removing it. So this will be in like custodian solutions to like abstract the Web3 layer completely away, even for some of these players, until they're like set up to actually use MetaMask. So yeah. What was the second question? Sorry.
Just sort of how does Toucan actually make money to then
exactly
keep that innovation going?
Yeah, so currently there's only one place where we make money, and that's when you have a carbon pool, you have NCT. Right now there's a spectrum of credits from 2012 to like 2020 in there, and we obviously want to incentivize this pool to automatically renew itself, right? So how the pool works is that every year this window goes one step further. So next year only credits from 2013 will be accepted, and then in the year after 2014, etc. So right now, if you redeem one of these credits out of the pool, if you redeem the oldest, it's free. However, if you pick a specific project to kind of scoop off the cream, then you tax, then you pay. And you pay both to Toucan. So there's a fee that goes to Toucan, but half of that fee, or like an equal, there's 5% go to Toucan and 5% are used to burn the oldest credits in that pool as well. So it's kind of like a tax to the pool to automatically renew the pool over time. So this is right now the only place where we kind of extract. However, what I really like about it is that we extract, but we also, in the same way, use that to burn carbon, right? So that's something that I would love to see other projects in Web3 to kind of adopt, is that whenever value is being created, some of that value could or should be redirected towards regeneration. And so yeah, that's currently how we operate. But we're working right now on like a more clever protocol design with like more dynamic pricing, etc., etc. So right now this is still a very dumb fee structure, I would say.
So is that built into the pool protocol or into the NFT protocol? Just out of curious technical detail.
That's built into the pool, right? So if you have entity and you want to select a specific carbon credit from Brazil from 2019 because you really like that project, then you'll pay 10%, a 10% fee, of which half of that fee is basically used to burn.
Have you ever, so each carbon offset though is captured as an NFT technically, an ERC 721 or something?
Actually, no. So we use NFT. So when we bring carbon credits on chain, we use an NFT, which is as a batch. So we move carbon credits on chain as a batch. So a batch can have a certain size, can be like 100 tons or like 1,000 tons or 1,000,000 tons, right? So, but then this batch gets fractionalized. So this NFT gets fractionalized into ERC20 tokens, vanilla ERC20 tokens that are project specific, right? So essentially each project, if you want to be super specific, each project and each vintage, so each year of verification of their project, have their own ERC20 token. It's a bit like wine, right? It's like wine from one vineyard of in the same year is fully fungible, right? So if you have a bottle of wine from vineyard A from 2017, if you have one bottle or the other bottle, you can swap them around, it doesn't matter. But the wine from 2018 from that same vineyard is not going to be the same wine. So carbon credits are a bit, well, actually the same, right? And the batch represents, if you want, the truck that is kind of moving the credits from Web 2 to Web 3, and basically then unloads all these bottles on chain into like an ERC20 token.
Interesting. Is there an idea in there back to the differences in the quality of a unit of carbon depending on the provenance? Is there an idea in there, just like artists often take the resale, a resale fee? Is there an idea in there that great carbon that gets moved around a lot in these markets because it's demanded actually could generate more capital?
Not yet. We've discussed like the royalty kind of system, but it's still no, like right now we haven't implemented it. But I really like that idea, right? Because the truth is that carbon, the end goal of a carbon credit is to be retired, right? Is to be burned, is to be removed out of circulation. And the trading of credits really is. It's an important function in the market to have trading, but ideally what we want to remove that carbon out of circulation because pumps the price also and incentivizes new projects to come online. So yeah, I actually like the idea of like having royalties that like disincentivize the moving around of credits too much.
Yeah, and another thing you touched on in there that's pretty interesting is that idea of protocols kind of taking their own responsibility for like when they create value to also offset that value, or I don't know if I was just thinking of the right way to phrase that, because it's more
it's not offsetting. That's exactly that. This is why like this is really important to me personally, because there's two ways you can approach this, right? Today, the current world is the unit of account, right? The starting point from when you think about carbon offsets is how much did I pollute? And what I'm trying to say here is the starting point should not be how much did I pollute. The starting point could just be how much value did I create, right? And then it's more like a voluntary carbon tax, really, where you say the starting point is the money, right? Is like, how much money did I make? And let's say 1% of that, right? 1% for the planet. Whatever revenue I do as a protocol, 1% of that will just go towards buying carbon credits and burning them, right? And it's not for me to claim that I'm the most carbon neutral, carbon whatever. It's just for me to claim that I redirect 1% of my revenue towards the planet, right? Which is a completely different claim. It's a completely different narrative. And I find it just much more appealing, actually. And if we think about it, there's much more money being created in the world than there's even carbon emitted, if you want, right? So
yeah. I mean, I have to tell you this little story.
Yeah.
I have to tell you this little story because your project and ReFi and kind of other projects in that umbrella got me really excited for this very old reason. When I was doing my PhD, we had these Friday colloquium where we had these really bright people come in every Friday and tell us about their research. And when you're studying biology, it's really widespread that almost any project that you do outside of maybe like microbial diversity or something, and even those, like that there's some segment of a talk that is going to be dedicated to ecosystem change, environmental loss, species loss. But when you're a scientist, that's just data. And it's just sort of happening. It's just the facts that are changing the study or changing the output. And so it became so routine to hear those pieces. And I would try to explain that to people that you maybe weren't familiar with that. And I would say, like, if you're a banker and you show up on Monday morning, you're given an objective for the amount of money you need to make. You either reach that objective and you get some bonuses, or you don't reach that objective and maybe your manager comes and tells you if you don't reach it the next week, you're going to be fired. But when you are working on things like the environment, that baseline that you want to achieve is one of no change, essentially. And if you don't meet it, the baseline drops. You can never go backwards in a way. Like you can't. It will take millions of years to invent new species, and they won't even be the same species that we lose. Ecosystems the same way. Climate has some elasticity, obviously, but not if habitats are lost, not if ecosystems are lost along the way, things like that. But I really loved the framing of ReFi and this idea that at least this piece of it, we can think of ways to we can sort of change the dimension of the problem so that we're attacking the baselines that can be moved up, right? That we can beat them this year so that we can move the baseline up next year and keep beating it again. And that's going to have this positive impact that those other baselines that just can't be moved don't move. And it really excited me. So so then the piece that you were kind of touching on there is this, I'd call it like the innovator's responsibility, right? Like we're going to build new technologies. How do we think about fitting them into that mold? And so I was hoping maybe you could, like, from the Tableland perspective, we're trying to build a new protocol. We want that protocol to do good in the world beyond just being an interesting technology that facilitates some like creators use cases and organizes the world's metadata. How do we do good in this domain? So how should we be thinking about things like the Toucan protocols and carbon pools and sort of the opportunities there? And not necessarily just for Tableland. I'm kind of thinking of like other creators that are listening in and other projects that come behind us again. Like, how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah. So this is the actual reason that we started Toucan. Like I'm really excited for what comes next, right? I'm really excited for all the applications that you can build once the Lego exists, right? So the bridge we built because somebody needed to build the bridge, right? But there's so much cool stuff that you can do once you have carbon on chain. And I just as a project, one project I think illustrates it quite well is a project called Atlantis World. They're basically building a metaverse front end to DeFi, right? So you have a little avatar, you can walk around, and there's like a sushi restaurant where you can interact with sushi swap, right? But there's also a big forest, and they wanted at each tree in that virtual forest has actually sequestered carbon in the real world, right? So you can create this direct link between some kind of metaverse object, NFT, and the impact that has been created in the real world. And as a user, you can then actually go there, you can plant a tree, which is basically, you do that by burning carbon credits. And so you can create all these, I mean, you can gamify, you can create incentives for people to do good, right? So that's one direction. And that's simply possible because we have the carbon, the pools, but we also have like kind of auxiliary contracts that help you as a developer to basically just throw any token, throw like DAI, USDC, whatever in that contract. It automatically goes and buys carbon, it burns it, and it sends you the NFT, like which is like the certificate back. So you don't even have to worry about it, right? And so I would say there were like other like NFT projects which like use that in their like NFTs directly to like, you know, some of the royalties go towards burning credits or whatever. So then as a protocol, I think you're in an extremely beautiful position, because if you as a protocol, you decide to implement some kind of regenerative like finance practices by possibly redirecting some of redirecting some of your revenue towards burning carbon credits, all your users, like when they interact with your protocol, like it's just baked in, they don't even have to think about it, right? And I think this is the level of deepness that we need to get to, and this is why I am excited about programmable carbon, is because we can bake that into the core protocols of Web3, right? And I'm convinced that Web3 is going to be the future of finance and of probably our economy. So we have here a possibility to just bake the regenerative part directly into the core fabric of this, and just remove that burden even from the user having to make an active decision. So, and then obviously, because your protocol that allows other builders to like, you know, leverage Tableland, into like including Toucan maybe in, you know, making it easy from a builder's perspective that uses Tableland to directly tap into the power of Toucan to again reduce the barrier for them to build it into their creations. I think is a very obvious point. And then something that I haven't touched on at all is where like carbon credits are an extremely interesting asset just from like a treasury perspective as well, right? So if you're like a big DAO, whatever, big protocol, you have like your treasury in, you know, some of it in ETH, some of it in DAI, whatever. Carbon is actually a very interesting asset. And if you look at the price of carbon on chain compared to the market, the crypto market, right? It's a pretty uncorrelated asset. Everyone is bullish on carbon. So I think there's just also value as a kind of treasury manager of a protocol to think about diversifying your treasury into like part of it into holding carbon credits.
Random side question. I was looking for the source of truth for off-chain carbon markets, and I saw, you know, quotes everywhere from $10 a ton to, you know, some of the higher end ones of like hundreds of dollars a ton. If taking that as like roughly true, and I think that a ton carbon through Toucan right now is sub $10. Is that right? It's like,
yeah, I mean, I don't know so it depends where you look, right? So
yeah,
the biggest problem is that from like a retailer, from an end user perspective, it's going to be extremely hard to find something that is even at $10, because as I like, retailers have no problem selling you a carbon credit that they bought for $2 or $3 at like 20. That's totally normal practice, right? So essentially what you get with Toucan is you get access to a wholesale market, but as a retail user. That's one thing. The second one is you find carbon credits off chain even at like a couple of cents, like 50 cents, $1. I wouldn't say they're good credits, right? And I want to make it clear also in BCT, like in the base carbon ton and Toucan, they're not just good credits there, right? And this comes from the kind of launch history of Toucan and in collaboration with KlimaDAO that had this sweep the floor narrative, right? Of like kind of buying up the floor credits essentially and locking them into the black hole of KlimaDAO. So BCT is made up of a lot of renewable energy projects like wind, hydros, solar, etc., that have less co-benefits than like planting trees, for instance, right? Which might have positive impact on local communities, on like biodiversity, etc. So this is where these different price points come from.
Yeah. So it sounds a lot like, pools are the future, which actually,
I think it's part of it, right? I think
it's
it's one function of the market. I think the carbon credit market is quite diverse still.
Yeah.
And not all the carbon in the world fits into a pool, right? Because a pool essentially is a commodity, and a commodity optimizes for the lowest kind of band in that specific commodity, right? So pools work really well for like big groups of homogeneous carbon credits, right? Like forestry or like renewable energy. But then there's more like boutique credits, maybe like I don't know, direct air capture, or like some soil carbon projects that might not profit from a pool infrastructure. And in that scenario, there will be the possibility to directly sell your credit at a given price, basically to put a price tag on your TCO2. So before it goes into the pool, right, your credit with the metadata, just put a price tag on this. And if somebody wants to buy it at that given price, well, they can just pay you that price and the trade is executed. So I see pools more as like, it serves a good chunk of the current market, but I don't want to say it's like the catch-all solution.
Yeah, makes sense. So another random side piece there is that's our philosophy is metadata is the future. So I can see it popping out here all over the place. So.
I honestly, like, I sent this to one of our architects. It's like, because
cool.
I'm actually quite interested to check out Tableland from like a Toucan builder's lens, right? Like, how could we actually leverage that? Because metadata is a huge topic, right, for us. And I would say that if we wanna scale Toucan to allow anyone to bring tokenized carbon credits on chain from different registry, from different sources, etc., I think the current data model that we have might not scale as well. So I'm really interested to we actually might be a user of Tableland as well.
Well, we'll talk a bunch more. I guess I want to be mindful of people's time here. I'm super excited for that conversation. Obviously, I'm very excited for where Toucan is going. Maybe just to leave people off with a sense of direction. Where should people go to, especially the kind of creators among the listeners? Where should they go to start learning how to build with Toucan?
Yeah, so we actually have what we call the Builders Hub, which is at developer.toucan.Earth. So the Builders Hub essentially is like it's meant for builders, and it has all the docs on like how to build with carbon. There's also like quite significant grant funding out there from Toucan, also in collaboration with Coinbase and soon like other sources as well, to just like allow people to play around with it. So developer.toucan.earth is a great place to start. Then just toucan.earth is our main website, where you'll find other things, also links to our Discord, links to our forum, links to our docs, etc. And most importantly, the links to our jobs page, because like everyone in Web3 were like hiring like crazy. So if you want to build the future, come to us. Sorry, you guys are probably hiring as well, right? So
people have different missions. They should end up on the right ship. So definitely people should check you out. I mean, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm coming out of it even more hyped about what we can do in Web3 to solve some of these big problems, even more hyped about Toucan and some of the technology that you're creating, and even more hyped about a possible set of collaborations here. So this has been great, Raphaël.
Equally so, I really enjoyed it. And like, let's maybe, let's put something in the calendar for like next year. I'd be curious to repeat that session in a year and see where we are, right? Because as you said earlier, Web3, the pace in Web3 is just incredible. And just like as a last thought, this is also like Toucan is a bet on this pace, right? It's a bet on the builders, on the creativity in Web3 to come up with solutions that we couldn't even dream of, and to essentially tackle the climate crisis at scale and fast enough, right? Because we're just running out of time. And I don't know any other community in the world that is like so creative, so innovative, and just moving so quickly. So
Totally.
Yeah, really, really curious to see what people build on top of us, right? So
well, May 6th, 2023, let's do that. And I'm here to take that bet with you. I'm pretty excited about it.
Perfect. Cool.
Thanks again.
Then thank you. Good time.